Welcome to the G5 Hive and our next installment of our Worker Bee series, where we deep dive the G5 college football landscape with the folks that know the teams the best. If you're watching us on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. If you're listening to us in podcast form, please rate and review. Today, we'll be heading over to the Mid-American Conference for some MACtion and taking a look at the Toledo Rockets, who are coming off an 8-4 season that was capped off by an exciting bowl record 6 overtime game win in the Game Above Sports Bowl. No spring game for the Rockets, but they just wrapped up their 2025 spring practice with their last spring practice on April 4th. We have a special guest joining us today. He is a college sports reporter and golf writer for the Toledo Blade. He is Kyle Rowland. Kyle can be found on X at Kyle Rowland. Welcome to the show, Kyle.
How you doing? Happy to be here.
Great. We're happy to have you back again. And for those who are maybe just tuning in to the G5 Hive for the first time, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and how long you've been covering Toledo football?
I have been covering UT since the 2021 season. I've lived in Toledo. I've worked at the Blade for 10 years now. Lived in Northwest Ohio for 15 years. So I feel like I'm a local now, very, very in tune to UT and kind of, the university, the athletic department, all that kind of stuff. So feel like I've been here my whole life now.
Well, let's move over to some Toledo football and start on the offense. For those not familiar with the Rockets' offensive style, how would you describe it?
Well, last year, the run game I would describe as non-existent. I don't know, a modern, kind of like that modern spread offense. Like the thing that was interesting, I previously covered Ohio State, and everyone, always thought like Urban Meyer, this, throw it around, chuck it around, like spread offense. But he was always like, he wanted to have a really good run game. And I feel like Toledo is similar. Like people have this perception of Toledo just airing it out. They've always had pretty good quarterbacks who put up some numbers. But same thing, like they want to establish the run. They want to run the football. Kareem Hunt, Penny Boone, Terry Swanson. I mean, you go back, they've always had like these good running backs. They didn't have that last year. They think they're going to have that this year with Chip Trainum. We'll talk, I'm sure, at length about that. So just kind of like that modern spread type offense, but they want to establish the run and really kind of ground and pound you if you can.
Well, let's get to the position where it all starts on offense, and that's the quarterback. Coming to the 2024 spring or the 2024 season, the question was, how would this team look without DeQuan Finn at the helm? Overall, I thought things went pretty well. Tucker Gleason was close to 3,000 yards passing. He had a 3-to-1 passing touchdown to interception ratio. He also added close to 500 yards on the ground and ran it a team-leading 7 times. What are the expectations surrounding Gleason heading into year 2 as a starter?
Yeah, I thought he was pretty good last year. I mean, I didn't think there was some considerable drop-off from Finn to him. I do think in the games they lost, he struggled, which, I mean, a lot of times there's correlation between losses and the quarterback not playing well. But, I mean, he had some bad turnovers in the Western Kentucky game. He played horrible at Buffalo. His biggest issue was turning the ball over and mostly fumbling the ball. Seemed to really be some kind of ball control issues with him. But I think he's good. I mean, I think he is good enough to win the MAC championship. I think he can, lead Toledo to an 11-1 season and be ranked in the top 25. He's got good weapons around him. I think the whole offense kind of was exposed last season for not having a run game and not having a very good offensive line. And at times, Gleason was a victim of that weak O-line. But I think he's an accurate enough passer. I think he makes plays. He's got a little it factor, kind of moxie to him. I think he's a good leader. I think he's someone that players want to follow in the huddle. I mean, if there's 2 minutes left in a game, I think he probably has a really good presence to himself in the huddle. Whereas, I don't know, other quarterbacks, I mean, Finn in particular, obviously is great. I mean, his stats were great, but he was a quiet not a real loud guy. And you don't necessarily have to have that for your quarterback, but I think it is a positive thing if your quarterback is that way.
And John Allen Richter, he was a backup last season and played sparingly. He did get one start for the injured Gleason and help them in a team. I don't know if you would call it an exciting game. It was interesting.
It was a bad one.
The 13-6 win over NIU. I would assume he's going to continue to be the number 2.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, he's a guy. I mean, they've talked about for several years now. I mean, obviously he's not the starter, so he's not as good as Gleason. But they were really excited about him. I think it was South Carolina wanted him to gray shirt when Toledo got him, but he opted not to. But he was he's from Georgia, was kind of getting some sniffs by some SEC schools and some of the higher caliber G5 schools down in the South. I think he's solid. I mean, that Northern game you mentioned, obviously the score was bad. It was kind of an ugly game, but I mean, first career college start. I mean, Northern Illinois, a month before, beat Notre Dame on the road. And I mean, he went in there and was able to do what he needed to do for Toledo to win the game. So I thought that was a big time positive. He definitely has that leadership quality, I would say. Solid backup. I mean, you don't want to lose your starter, but I don't think the season would be over if John Allen Richter had to play.
For those who maybe haven't heard about Jake DeHaan or Caleb Osborne, what have you seen or heard about their progression this season?
Yeah, Osborne was a guy great high school player in Michigan. He was injured last season and did not play. I can envision him as a third stringer this year. Kind of a dual threat guy. He's bigger. I forget. I feel like he might be 6'2", 6'3". But yeah, I mean, he's a very solid player. Going to be irrelevant this season, I would say, or Toledo wants him to be irrelevant.
Yeah.
Moving on to the running game, this room graduated Jacquez Stewart and Savon Clark, but this room was able to return their leading rusher from a year ago in Collar Wallendzak. They also returned Willie Shaw III and Dane Nauman. This room also added Kenji Christian from North Carolina A&T and Chip Trayanum from Kentucky. For those not familiar with Chip, he was originally at Arizona State, where he played running back before transferring to Ohio State, where he played linebacker. Then he became a running back. Then he went to Kentucky, and now he's at Toledo. At Kentucky, he missed the first 5 games last season due to a broken hand he suffered just before the season started in 2024. What should we make of this running back room, and how do the transfers fit into the equation?
Chip Trayanum fits in big time. I mean, I've been covering college sports for, 15 years now. And I don't know if I've ever heard so much hype and excitement around one player for one team during a spring than Trayanum this year. I mean, he just absolutely seems like he's going to be a massive difference maker for Toledo. I mean, he was good at every stop he's been. I mean, he's played well. I mean, he was solid at Ohio State. And scored the winning touchdown in the Notre Dame game. I don't know if you guys remember that a couple years ago, the buzzer. He played well against Michigan when Ohio State lost to them. I mean, he's good, and he just blew everyone away in the spring. The line is better too, but if he avoids injury, is healthy all year, I think the hype and the expectations surrounding Toledo, because locally there's tons of expectations, even nationally. I mean, it seems like they're probably going to be the favorite. They're a dark horse, playoff G5 team this year. I think that's all pretty fair and probably warranted. The schedule sets up well for them, but that backfield, it has to work. Kenji Christian, transfer from North Carolina A&T, is another one that seems like is going to be. Even though Trayanum gets all the attention, it's not going to be just him. They're going to need kind of committee, multiple guys. Connor Wallendzak and Willie Shaw, 2 guys who have been on the team for a few years. they're solid options, but they just can't be the feature guy. I mean, it was unbelievable. I've never seen a team struggle in short yardage like Toledo last season. I mean, if it was like 3rd and 2, like they should have just sent the punt team out almost. Like they just were not going to be able to gain 2 yards or even 1 yard to make it 4th and 1 to try to go for it on 4th and 1. I mean, they probably missed like 10 4th and 1s last year. Just could not get any short yardage. And it wasn't all because of the line. I mean, the running backs were a huge problem there. But I mean, I think Trainum brings a level of kind of, I don't know. I mean, certainly leadership, but also just like playing for Arizona State and Ohio State and Kentucky. Kentucky wasn't great last year, so maybe that's not the best example, but just being in cultures where, you're playing at the highest level, what it takes to win, things like that. I mean, especially at Ohio State. So I just think for, many reasons, it's a huge addition, but whether it was Jason Candle, other assistant coaches, kind of, donors and friends of the program or whatever. I mean, if you talk to anyone who attended a Toledo practice this spring, it was just like, wow, like this Chip Trainum guy is something else.
So it sounds like he's definitely going to be the featured back. Can you kind of, the other backs like Kenji and, Connor and Willie, can you maybe for our listeners kind of share maybe the skill sets they have that might, offer something different, whether, one of them's the speed guy, one's the pass catching guy, et cetera, and maybe how they might, be rotated into the offense.
Yeah. I mean, I would say Trainum and Christian are similar, just your traditional running back, what you would think of as a running back. Trainum definitely can catch the ball out of the backfield. I don't know as much about Christian, just from I'm not super familiar and I haven't watched, a lot of past games of his. Rowland Zach is kind of your All-American. He's a local kid, was an unbelievable high school player. He's just kind of like the All-American clean-cut boy who gets every ounce out of his ability. He's not fast. He's not a farm boy, but he's kind of like what you would imagine, like a Midwestern farm kid. He's a great baseball player. He's actually going to go to Purdue to play baseball, but he just loves football and decided to come to Toledo. And then Shaw, he's another guy. When he committed to Toledo, some people were surprised that lower level Big Ten teams didn't take a bigger chance on him. And he's had his moments. He's also been injured a lot at Toledo. But I mean, just a normal running back, not some outstanding, diverse skill set or whatever. But I mean, reliable, especially if he's not the number one guy, is how I would kind of describe him.
I think I know the answer to this question, and it's going to be some irony, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Who do we see get that first carry against Kentucky?
Yeah, well, yeah, especially because he came from Kentucky. Yeah, I mean, it's going to be Chip Trainum, I think, unless Jason Candle's got something up his sleeves, which I don't discount that. But yeah, I mean, I would expect just a healthy dose of Trainum. I mean, Toledo's really ridden. When they have good running backs, they ride them pretty strong. I mean, Bryant Koback a few years ago, I don't know if you guys remember him, but yeah, he definitely had a lot of carries and then could take those carries. And I think Trainum will be similar in that instance.
Well, let's move over to this deep and talented wide receiving room. The Rockets leading wide receiver in terms of yardage and first team all conference while Jerron Newton graduated and they saw Larry Stevens head over to Indiana State. Everyone else who caught a ball in this room in 2024 is back for 2025. Plus the room added Travion Rudolph from NIU. At NIU, he was their leading receiver last season. Also, do me a favor, hit pause on this recording right now, wherever you're at. Look up Travion Rudolph, Kent State, November 3rd, 2021. Trust me, just do it. Just make sure to come back and hear the rest of this conversation. All right. So you also have first team all conference and the MVP of the bowl game, Junior Vandeross, a third returning in that bowl game, in that exciting 6 overtime bowl game. He had 12 receptions for 194 yards and 1 touchdown. With all the guys returning and adding Rudolph, what are the expectations for this group heading into the season?
Yeah, I mean, through the roof. I mean, it really is insane how good that wide receiver room is. I mean, talking to the wide receiver coach, he's just like, I can't believe. I mean, Rudolph was just like an incredible pickup. I mean, he's one of the most productive receivers in Northern Illinois history, and he decides to transfer to Toledo for the final. I mean, it's an unbelievable, weapon to have. Especially, I think Vandeross is. I mean, certainly the best wide receiver in the MAC. I mean, he's a really, really good guy. He's a game breaker. He's got the speed. He can catch, an 85-yard pass or whatever. A huge weapon. So then when you have that, and then you have Rudolph on the other side of him, who, is also a super productive guy, it opens it up for everyone. Thomas Zyros is another guy who, he's a local kid, hasn't quite lived up to his billing, but I think he, could do big things this year. Zamarian Lang was someone who everyone talked about coming into last year. He decommitted from South Carolina on signing day to sign with Toledo, and just really didn't have a huge opportunity because Newton and Vandeross were so good last year. I would expect him to break out this year. Terrell Crosby, an Iowa State transfer, seems like another guy who probably will get some chances. Tashi Braceful is a redshirt freshman who put up insane numbers in high school in Michigan, Detroit. And Jediah Willoughby is someone that coaches talked about in the spring as being that person that not a lot of people know who he is, that they think will take the leap that people will hear more about. But I mean, it really is, for a group of 5 team, an embarrassment of riches at wide receiver. And that's, when you have, I keep talking about the hype and the expectations, but if you do have this great running game with Chip Trainum, and you have a lot of, proof of concept, known quantities of wide receiver who are good. Seems like your quarterback's probably good. And now he's got another offseason and all this time. It starts kind of adding up, wow, this offense could be really, really good this season.
Well, first of all, I want to apologize to Trayvon Rudolph. I said Travion. That's my fault. So when you're listening to this, don't hate me. Inside joke. Did anyone else stand out in the spring to you? Kind of went through a lot of those guys, but was there anyone that really was having a connection there with Gleason?
Connection, I would say usual suspects, but Willoughby, who I mentioned, is, one of those guys that certainly stood out that people wouldn't think about. And then Eric Holly, he just, talk about a guy who looks good getting off the bus. He has the body, the hands, everything, the height. He actually was going to be could have played basketball at Akron, which great, program, but came to Toledo to play football. He just has never been able to put it together. He has some boneheaded penalties, or he'll have drops, and if he could put it together, he really seems like he could be a great player. So I think that's another guy. If you want to talk about, under the radar, he could, perhaps do something.
Who do you think we see out there week one catching passes for Tucker? I assume we got Rudolph. You probably bring him in to do some damage. You got Vandeross, who's great last season. Who's maybe that third guy we see out there?
I kind of think it's going to be Willoughby, just from kind of what you see, what you hear. They seem really happy with him. I think Zyros is a guy who, he's just been in the program for so long that kind of helps. And he's made big plays, but he just hasn't consistently done it. I don't know. Obviously, like I said, Zamarian Lang. So many people talked about him and wondered about him. So, I think the third guy is just absolutely wide open.
Who do you think, with Rudolph and Vander Ross here, who do you think is going to step up and be the lead wide receiver for this offense in 2025?
I think Vander Ross. He and Gleason just have an unbelievable connection too. I mean, they've done it in games now. They obviously do it outside of games. I mean, he's just a super reliable guy. They're comfortable with each other. I mean, you mentioned the bowl game. I mean, he was just ridiculously good in that bowl game. I feel like he had really good stats in the Mississippi State game too. I kind of forget. I feel like he maybe had like 7 catches against Mississippi State. I mean, those are 2 obviously big time opponents. Those are 2 unbelievable wins for Toledo last season. If you can do it against those teams, and yeah, I mean, maybe Pitt and Mississippi State aren't your upper echelon power conference teams, but they're still, power conference programs, and they should have better players than Toledo. So anytime you can kind of show out against those types of opponents, it kind of shows what kind of and Vander Ross, I mean, he's a for sure draft pick next year, like no doubt about it.
And when you talk about that game, 41-17 win over Mississippi State at Mississippi State. Junior Vander Ross, 7 receptions, 73 yards, and a touchdown.
Yeah, he was great. I mean, that game was also. I picked Toledo to win that game. I thought they would win. Like, did not think it was going to be a blowout. Like, never in a million years. But yeah, I mean, it was one of those things. Like, as you're watching it, it's like, well, like Mississippi State's eventually going to make a run. Like, can I really like start writing a story yet? And then it got to the point. It's like, okay, like this is an absolute bloodbath.
Moving over to the tight ends, if you were to describe how the tight ends are utilized in this offense as someone that's never caught a Toledo game, how would you describe it?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, not enough. I mean, I think most, whether you're a fan of a college team or an NFL fan or an NFL team, and I think most people probably say that. I mean, there's obviously exceptions, but it just seems like everyone has good athletic tight ends now, and that they should just be more into the offense. And I mean, Toledo uses them. I mean, Anthony Torres last year was good, and it just seemed like you should be throwing to him as much as some of your wide receivers. When you have a guy like that gifted. And this year, I mean, the position, it's wide open. I couldn't tell you right now who the starting tight end will be. I mean, they have some really athletic guys. I mean, CeCe Ezram is another guy who, like, getting off the bus, like, you would be intimidated, be like, man, like that guy looks really good. Like he'd be, like when you used to play basketball and like you look across the way, it's like, oh man, I don't want to guard that guy. Like he kind of is that in football form. But I would assume they won't get as much production from tight end this season. Just because I think there's going to be a little bit of a drop off in how good the tight end is. And I think they're going to be able to run very effectively, and they have good wide receivers. So I just think tight end's kind of the odd man out.
You mentioned, Anthony Torres being gone, and he was used heavily in the red zone. Yeah. Do you think they will use the tight ends as much in the red zone, or given all the talent they have at wide receiver, probably not as much Torres?
Yeah, I don't know as much. I mean, that's definitely Toledo's MO, though. I mean, like they do use the tight ends in the red zone. I mean, if you go back, I mean, their tight ends score a lot of touchdowns. Like they'll have like 30 receptions and 8 of them will be touchdowns. But whether they do that same mold next year, I mean, I also think the run game obviously impacts that when you don't have a reliable short yardage kind of red zone running attack. That probably brings the tight ends more into play. But they'll get creative. I mean, Jason Candle, I think he's good at kind of dialing things up and figuring out weaknesses. So someone will emerge too as a reliable tight end. It's just going to be a mystery. We probably we're not going to know who it is until late September.
Well, coming into the 2024 season, the Rockets were looking to replace their entire offensive line. 2025 is a little different story. The Rockets bring back left guard Carter Foudy, right guard Ethan Spoth, and right tackle Cole Rett. Center Jacob James and left tackle Allen Jones Jr. have graduated. However, James and Jones Jr. both missed 3 games during the season in their absence. Right guard Ethan Spoth played center, and Grant Zimmerly took over duties at right guard, while Stephen Gales filled in at left tackle. So while on paper the team looks to replace their center and left tackle, I believe the Rocket fans should feel good heading into the season. The staff also brings in 5 transfers to help bolster this room. What are your expectations for this room heading into 2025?
I mean, good only because it can't be worse. And it wasn't worse because they weren't good at their job necessarily. They had a million injuries, which was a problem. I mean, they were constantly having backups play. They had to have guys change position, play out of position. It was a disaster. I mean, it was a perfect storm of subpar play, injuries, and, trying to plug and play basically. So I think they'll be good. I mean, Spoth, you mentioned, I think he's solid. Cole Rhett, they love. He played well last year. Stephen Gales, I think he'll start this year. He had his moments. Grant Zimmerly played outstanding in his first ever start at Mississippi State. He was kind of one of the MVPs of that game. Ibrahim Traore is a Penn State transfer. He did not play last year because he was injured, but they like him. I mean, the O-line coach, he's happy with him. Carter Foudy is a experienced guy. So, I mean, I think the O-line will be pretty solid. I thought they were good in the spring. And there's just a difference about it as well. I mean, I'm just completely beating a dead horse, but when you have a solid run game, it helps. I mean, I think it gives confidence. And I just think they're better too. So I would say, I wouldn't say they're going to be the best offensive line in the MAC, but I think they'll be one of the top 3 or 4 offensive lines in the MAC.
So who does this room look to be as like the leader of the offensive line?
That's a good question. I mean, I kind of think Ethan Spoth is that guy. He's been around. I think he's got that kind of, I don't know, not necessarily, moxie is not the right word. I don't know what the right word is, but I think he has it. But I think a lot of times with the line, I think linemen in general are kind of just built to be leaders. I mean, linemen just have an attitude. You know what I mean? Like not a whole lot of like quiet, like reserved offensive linemen. I almost think it's a problem if you are that way. If you're a lineman,
it's almost like an angry dad who like you're letting all the cold air get out. It's like, and then they get hurt and they're in the pile, and it's like, all right, I got to get back up and get to the line because that's what we got to do. We got to get up and get to work.
Yeah, no, for sure. I mean, I think their line coach. I really enjoy talking to him. It seems like every team's O-line coach is always, under fire because no matter, even if you're an Ohio State fan or a Georgia fan, you probably are just mad about your O-line play. Like O-line play can never be good enough. It just like does not matter. Fans just go nuts about it. So he takes a beating at time, but I think he's a really good coach. And he's super smart. Like I really enjoy talking to him about offensive line play. But yeah, I mean, I expect, I mean, they're quietly optimistic. Having covered Toledo for 5 years now, I feel like you can kind of read how people talk or facial expressions and the tone. And I think that they're excited about their line.
All right, Kyle, if you had to pick an offensive player to have a breakout type season in 2025, who would that be?
Any offensive player?
Yep, any offensive player.
That's a good question. I mean, I'm not going to say train him because like he's a senior in college, even though he hasn't been at Toledo. He that's too easy. I mean, I'll say either Willoughby or Terrell Crosby, another wide receiver. I think one of those guys will have an all MAC type of season.
All right. Well, let's move over to the defensive side of the ball. And for those not familiar with Toledo's defensive scheme, how would you describe it?
The last couple of years, it's way better than like bend but don't break. I mean, they're ranked, top 50s, top 30s. Before that, they were really good. I mean, they struggle at times getting hit with big plays, big running plays. That was an issue at times last year. It was part personnel, obviously. I mean, Vince Karras, the defensive coordinator, really, really solid coach. Actually, the winningest coach in college football history right now, or best win percentage from his time as head coach at Mount Union. Physical, very physical on the defensive line. I mean, they had a couple draft picks a couple years ago. They, what's his face? I'm drawing a complete blank. Just got drafted in the 3rd round this year. They always have great D-line play. Linebackers are always kind of iffy. And then the secondary is usually really good. I mean, obviously, Quinyon Mitchell, everyone knows about him. Emmanuel McNeil-Warren is going to be kind of the next guy who they say he's a top 100 draft prospect for next season. Avery Smith, a cornerback, is another guy who I think will be drafted next year. I think he led the country or was either second in the country in pass breakups last year.
So,
yeah, that's their defense.
Darius Alexander.
Darius. Gosh, I can't believe I forgot his name.
So while the offense has had a lot of the same faces in 2025, the defense sees several guys graduate. Let's start with the guys up front along the defensive line. By way of graduation or the portal, this group sees their top 3 linemen in terms of snap depart from this room. 4 if you kind of count Deshaun Holt, who I think they list him as an outside linebacker, but he kind of plays like an edge role. Yeah. Those 4 guys combined for 108 pressures and 15 sacks in 2024. It's not all bad news, as the Rockets return several rotational guys who look to take a step up to some of these starting roles. They include Martez Pointer, Eshawn Carter, and Doran Ray Jr. on the interior, Malachi Davis, Anthony Dunn Jr., and if you want to look at the outside linebacker edge guy, maybe even a Jeremiah Peters as well. But how did that defensive line look this spring?
Good. I mean, I don't think Toledo's ever going to have like a bad defensive line. It's incredibly consistent. They lost their coach too in the offseason. But I mean, Malachi Davis, Martez Pointer, Anthony Dunn, I mean, really, really good players. I think Dunn is the guy who is incredibly underrated. If you look at his numbers last year and then the number of snaps he played, I mean, insanely productive. I think he'll be even better this year. I thought he was probably a hard guy for Toledo to keep. Seems like in the transfer portal, he would have been someone that you take a chance on if you need some pressure on the defensive line. Eshawn Carter, I think you mentioned him, really, solid player. Yeah, I mean, I think the D-line will be good. It's typically good. See no reason, why that would change, because so many of the guys that, even though you mentioned they did lose a lot, including a guy who was taken with the first pick of the 3rd round. I mean, I really just don't think there's going to be much drop off.
Speaking of the guy they lost in the NFL draft, 2nd team All MAC, and now New York Giant, Darius Alexander. He played on the interior in 2024. Is there anyone on this interior you think is going to be able to step up and kind of fill his shoes, so to speak?
I mean, Carter is a big body. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I think he's kind of a guy who, he's played well and he's had some games, but I think he's a guy who is, at the top of the totem pole for at that position in the interior.
We mentioned all the pressure that this line was able to cause on opposing offenses last season. Who in this room do you think is ready to kind of take that next jump and create that pressure or havoc here in 2025?
Yeah, I mean Malachi Davis and Martez Pointer. I mean, technically, I guess you could say done just because of he just didn't play a lot of snaps, but I think people know who he is because he did have some big games and his numbers were pretty gaudy. But I mean, I think Malachi Davis, Martez Pointer especially. I just think he's a punishing guy. He has a motor. He fights off blocks. I think he's a really, really good player. And he's done it against high level competition too. So, I mean, when you get into the MAC, I think he's a guy that just poses a lot of problems for opponents.
Well, like the defensive line, the linebacking group also took some hits. In terms of snaps, they lost their top 3 linebackers. Jackson Barrow, Daniel Bolden, and Lance Dixon have all graduated. That is your starting linebackers and a rotational guy the Rockets will be looking to replace here in 2025. This room brings back Damian Olsen II and Kayvon Sherman, who saw at least some action in 8 and 5 games respectively. They also return Chris Dapolonia, who missed most of the 2024 season due to a hip fracture he suffered in the first game, I think maybe within the first 15 snaps of the game. This staff also brought in Langston Long from USF, and after the spring, we expect Hudson Miller to join the Rockets from Purdue. First of all, is there any word on how Chris's road to recovery is going?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think Dapolonia is the guy at that position that they envision being the leader of that group, that linebackers room, and trying to emerge as a leader of the defense, even though he's young. Really smart player. He was a good special teams player. That's always kind of a sign at Toledo of things to come. He's selfless, smart. I think he's the one that really stands out. I mean, Sherman, I think, is another guy who's Olsen has been around a lot. I mean, he's been there 5 years, maybe even 6. But there's just, I mean, I think overall linebacker is just kind of a mystery because these guys haven't really played in huge moments. They lost, I mean, the amount of tackles of those guys you mentioned that just insane how much, I mean, they've just been there for so long. And it's something that a lot of teams right now are dealing with just because of the COVID, the extra year and red shirts and all this stuff. I mean, you had guys that played 6, sometimes 7 years in your program. So Toledo, obviously no different. But I mean, linebacker, if there's a question mark on the defense, it's definitely linebacker.
When you're talking about the tackles, 155 tackles amongst those 3.
Unlike the defensive line, the linebackers, this defensive secondary does return several key pieces from 2024. It's highlighted by 2 outstanding corners in Avery Smith and Nasir Bowers, and then 2 playmaking safeties in Emmanuel McNeil-Warren and Braden Alls. The biggest hit to this room is none other than first-team all-conference safety MACtion Hook, who led the team in tackles with 70 a season ago. This room also returns several guys who saw a handful of snaps in 2024, but they only combined for a little over 100. This room does have some experience at cornerback and safety, but you could say that the depth behind them does not necessarily have a ton of experience. Kind of curious to how you view this secondary heading into 2025. I
mean, I think the defensive secondary is every bit as rich and wealthy as the wide receivers. I mean, it's pretty crazy. I mean, Avery Smith, maybe the best corner in the MAC. McNeil-Warren, I would say, is the best safety. Nasir Bowers is also a really good corner. Braden Alls is a great safety, the total ball hawking guy who had a number of interceptions last year. And mean, you look at it and it's like, man, like they're going to be really hard to throw on this year. And that's including losing MACtion Hook, who was like kind of the heart and soul of the defense these last few years. And I think his unit is even better without him. It's kind of crazy to say that. So yeah, I mean, I think they'll be good. Another interesting guy, I don't know how much he'll play this year. Amari Snowden is a transfer from Wisconsin. He's actually going to play baseball and football at Toledo. But anytime you get a power conference transfer, you assume they'll probably, somewhat be a part of the rotation. And then Jaden Dotton is a guy last year who was in his second season at Toledo, or maybe third. Regardless, he transferred from Penn State, was a wide receiver. They had some injuries and were depleted late last season, so he moved to safety. Did decently well, had a pretty good bowl game against Pitt. And now he's, staying on that side of the ball playing defense. So interesting little thing to monitor there. They were happy with how well he progressed in the winter and then in the spring. So he's definitely like made the full-time change. Like he will not be playing offense anymore unless something crazy happens.
Well, a season ago, McNeil-Warren, missed some games due to injury. Did he look fully recovered this spring?
Yeah.
Is he good to go?
Yeah, he's good to go. And he's a guy too. I mean, I've written about this and kind of talked about it. I mean, the culture at Toledo, like Jason Candle deserves like massive props for, obviously like Quinyon Mitchell, Nick Saban talked about it on the draft, how like he was the number one guy on like their transfer board. Like they wanted him bad and they tampered and he didn't leave. He stayed at freaking Toledo. McNeil-Warren is another one of those guys, like absolutely could have left. I heard from incredibly reliable sources close to Max and Hook last year that Big Ten program called and just said, like, you got a blank check, like we want you. He stayed. So I just think like the culture at Toledo is a real thing. And the ability to keep these high level guys. Darius Alexander obviously was a draft pick this year. I think they've had 12 draft picks in the past 9 or 10 drafts, which is really good. For a group of 5 program.
With that loss of Max and Hook, who kind of fills that role from to me, I would characterize that role as he's kind of like a in the box safety.
Yeah.
Is there someone that on this team that you feel like is going to kind of step in and maybe not from a leadership perspective, but from a production perspective, come in and kind of fill Max and Hook's role?
I think Braden Knowles. He's a guy who Hook loved collisions. It was just like you if you had the ball, you did not want to be anywhere near him. And I think Braden Knowles was a very similar type of player. And he played really well last season. He was really good. He's another local kid, played at Central Catholic here in Toledo, which is one of the best programs in the entire state of Ohio. And he was really good in high school. I was surprised that he came to Toledo. I thought, a Big Ten school would take a flyer on him. So we've just seen him and heard about him forever. And he definitely has lived up to kind of the hype immediately in college at Toledo.
Well, if you had to pick a defensive player, any defensive player to have a breakout type season in 2025, Kyle, who you got?
That is a great question. I kind of want to say Dapolonia linebacker, or just one of the linebackers in general, because they essentially have done nothing in their college career. I guess I'll target Dapolonia on that. But there'll be a defensive lineman who puts up some really good, all MAC type numbers, I bet, this season. I just don't know who it's going to be.
Well, we've talked some offense and some defense. Now let's move over to the special teams. How did those units look in the spring, and are there any concerns?
I don't think so. Stanton Weber, the special teams coordinator, this will be his 3rd year now. He's done, great work at Toledo. Their special teams were dreadful before he got there. Literally the worst in the country the season prior. Cost them games, undoubtedly. And I think he's probably won them games. I mean, it's funny. I mean, obviously we talk about offense and defense all the time, and I understand why. And special teams doesn't get a ton of attention, but it really can be a huge positive or negative. Toledo's built it into a positive now. The only issue last year, Dylan Kunanen was pretty good most of the season, and then they lost the Akron game because of him, I would say. Missed several chip shot field goals, including one late that would have won the game. But he came back and made a really long one in the bowl game against Pitt. And that was nice to see for him. I mean, you hate to see kickers struggle because it's such a mental thing. Emilio Duran, the punter, was fine last season. He wasn't outstanding. I think he needs to improve this season. And Bryson Hammer, the punt returner last year, he's just a freshman walk-on, and he was really good, like one of the best in the country good. I mean, it seemed like he got 10 yards every return. I know his average probably didn't end up being that high, but it just seemed like he always was able to get positive yardage. So I think special teams pretty solid. As long as Weber's there, I think they'll probably have a good, reliable unit in special teams.
Well, Kyle, now that spring practice is over, which position group or groups do you think is the most concerning heading into the 2025 season?
I mean, I guess linebacker. I just think it's the biggest mystery. And there's so little proof of concept with all those guys. I don't think it's a red flag, though. It's just one of the units has to obviously be the one, and it just happens to be linebacker. I mean, you're always going to be concerned about the O-line until you see it in a game, I guess. I think the O-line will be okay, though. So the answer there, I guess, is linebacker.
In today's age of NIL, revenue sharing, and the transfer portal, how have you seen it change Toledo's recruiting philosophy?
That's a good one. I don't think it necessarily has. I mean, their philosophy is kind of, draw a circle from Detroit, out over Cleveland, and, kind of in Northwest Ohio or whatever. Like, that's like their bread and butter territory. They still attack that territory. They kind of flank out to Indiana and Pennsylvania. And then, Tampa, St. Pete, they just crush that area. And some other parts of Florida as well. So like it certainly hasn't changed like where they recruit. And I mean, they're a development program. They have a unbelievable track record of turning, 0-star guys into, draft picks in some cases. But certainly guys that are remembered at Toledo. They consistently always have one of the better class in the MAC. It was 2 years ago was the highest rated G5 class, like according to 247's rankings. So yeah, I mean, I don't think it's changed how they recruit or who they recruit. I mean, I think it changes the fact that they have to constantly recruit players on their roster.
Sure.
I mean, they've done an incredible job of keeping good players on their team. I mean, DeQuan Finn and Penny Boone left. And they had an offensive lineman leave a couple of years ago. I mean, other than that, they really haven't lost a whole lot. I mean, it's kind of remarkable, honestly.
Do you think the fact that the P4 seems to always seems to focus more on transfer portal, that it gives Toledo an access to a higher level of recruit maybe than they've had in the past?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's an interesting point, especially considering everything that happened with Bo Polston. I don't know if you're familiar with him, quarterback in the state of Indiana. I mean, he was like a legitimate target for Michigan and Georgia and Washington and some high caliber. Like, it wasn't a fake offer. I mean, I've talked to a lot of people about it. Like, they were real committable offers, and he chose Toledo. So I think that's kind of a remarkable thing. But yeah, I mean, there's certainly, I think more so, I know we're talking about football here, but I think that's probably more true in basketball. Because I mean, those programs truly are not taking high school players anymore. Yeah. Like, they're just getting transfers.
Or if you're not a one and done, they're not taking you.
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know because obviously the best programs are still getting a lot of high school kids in football, but I mean, I think it is an interesting question, and there probably is some truth to it.
So when you talk about, I'm kind of curious about the staff in navigating the portal, and you've talked about it a few times about they've just done a really good job of keeping these players on their roster. Do you see that or hear through the grapevines that that's something that they're doing throughout the season, or is it something more towards the beginning of the season or the end of the season that you seem to be recruiting your roster over again at the end or beginning of the season?
I think it's different things. I mean, I think it's true. I mean, people can roll their eyes or whatever. The culture is a real thing there. Like, Jason can't, his players love him. I mean, I haven't seen it at a lot of places like it. I mean, these guys are constantly coming back. Like, Kareem Hunt comes back to Toledo all the time. Cody Thompson, these guys that are in the NFL, they come back to Quinyon Mitchell last year, worked out for the draft in Toledo. He didn't go to Florida. He didn't go to Arizona. He was in Toledo the whole time. He came back, several times last year. I mean, there's the whole brotherhood thing. It's a real thing at Toledo. So I think that right there helps considerably. But I definitely think you kind of have to, obviously, when you're in the season, you're worried about the games and you're grinding constantly and everything. But I think it has to be on these coaches' minds just all the time of is this guy going to leave, or is this guy what are we going to do with it? You constantly in your head, you only have so many roster spots. Are you going to fill this spot through the portal? Or are you going to try to get a high school guy? I mean, all of it. I don't envy these guys, but that's also why they get paid a lot. So when I hear the complaints about the portal, it kind of annoys me, but everyone's industry changes, and now coaches are dealing with the same thing, but that's another thing. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a constant thing. Their NIL is decent. Their revenue sharing, they're very, very committed. The athletic director, Brian Blair, he does a great job. He's, he knows how important football is just in the current landscape of college sports. And he knows how important it is to the University of Toledo, the city, the area, these fans. They want good football teams. They're used to good football teams. So the resources, are really good. And I don't know, I guess it just kind of trickles down from there.
What do you think the main strength of this 2025 team will be?
Experience. I think they're probably the most experienced team in the MAC. I just saw today all those numbers came out from Bill Connolly. Pretty sure they're the most experienced team in the MAC. And it's not just experience. It's experience at key positions. Quarterback, his wide receivers. The secondary you're talking about. They've got guys where they need experience, and I think that's the ultimate thing.
Yeah, I think they're first in the MAC.
Yeah, first in the MAC, and they're probably top 50, top 40, and probably in the whole country.
Yeah, 35th, I think, in the country is what they're.
So, yeah, that's going to be a heck of a team. So, given all of this experience, and we talked about each room, what does success look like for the Rockets in 2025?
I mean, I think a MAC championship berth. I'm not going to say if you go 10-2 and lose in the MAC title game, I'm not going to say it's a failure. That's completely unfair. So, I mean, I think a success is getting to the MAC title game. But, I mean, winning it is certainly still, if you lose it, you're also not just going to say, "Oh, it was a great season. We got to the MAC title game." So it's kind of that medium in between, like winning it and getting there. But I mean, I think they need to as well. I mean, if you lose the opener at Kentucky, obviously, yes, you have to win out to get to the playoff, and even then, you might not make it. So, I mean, getting deep into the season with just all this excitement, I think, is another thing. It's just kind of been missing lately, as well as Toledo's done. I mean, I think I guess 2 years ago they were 11-1, and they did go into the MAC title game with an outside chance of being the G5. That was pre playoff expansion, but they just seem like last year they beat Mississippi State. The next week they lose to Western Kentucky. A few years back they lost, to San Diego State early, which after an Ohio State loss, which kind of took the wind out of everything. When they almost beat Notre Dame in 2021, they just laid a colossal dinosaur egg the next week and lost to Colorado State at home. That was Trey McBride's coming out party, though, the tight end. I mean, he was unreal in that game. So, yeah, I mean, just avoid the September bad loss. They've just done it too often where it kind of eliminates some of the excitement. I mean, if you lose to Kentucky, there's nothing wrong with that, but win out the rest of your non-conference games. I mean, they've got an incredibly favorable schedule, in my opinion, this season. I mean, Kentucky is imminently beatable. At Washington State later in the year is a winnable game that will earn you some credibility. Like they're in that category of they have respect. They're probably going to win like 8 games this year, and you can also beat them. Western Kentucky as well. I mean, that's a good G5 team. You have them at home. You should not lose that game. They play Akron and Kent, who are atrocious. That helps. Ball State, another one, probably not going to be very good this year. So I really think the schedule sets up really, really well for them.
Well, Kyle, we've covered a lot of ground today, but is there anything else you want to share, think we should know about this 2025 Toledo Rockets football team?
Now, other than, I mean, if you know nothing about Toledo, if you're a college football fan, I mean, I think they're a team to definitely, keep an eye on, put them in your back pocket. Remember the opening weekend, they're playing Kentucky, and if they win that game, I think, it'll be full steam ahead. There'll be tremendous excitement around the program. I mean, there has to be a G5 team, that makes the playoff this year. And I'm not going to pick them to make it. I'll probably pick them to go like 10-2 or 9-3 or something like that. But I really do think it's a realistic thing. Like if they end up making it, I don't think it should be some, massive, massive shock. They've got the talent. I think they've got the coaching. And as I said, they've got the schedule.
Well, Kyle, thank you very much for taking some time out of your day to spend with us and share your knowledge. We greatly appreciate it.
Absolutely, guys. Thank you.
If you're watching on YouTube, please hit that like and subscribe button. If you're listening in podcast form, please rate and review on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. Thank you all for your support. And until the next time, we are the G5 Hive.